Welcome back to our very cheap race car build. After rebuilding the engine in a previous episode, we've finally got it back in the car and we're hoping that it's ready for its first start. Everything's gone pretty smooth so far. We've double checked everything, but fingers crossed, things still happen. So what have we done? We've got everything in, it's plugged in, it's the original ECU, it's the original body control module, it's basically as it came out of the car, so it should be a runner. We've fixed the blown head gaskets, we've fixed the corrosion at the back of the engine, we've tidied up a few bits and pieces, new rings and bearings. What we've also done is put a decent coolant in it so it doesn't happen again. We've used the KCK long life coolant. Because of all the corrosion and the corrosion eating out the head gaskets, we're pretty determined for that not to happen again, so we used a decent coolant. Engine oil. We're using the KCK running in engine oil. Now we can stand here and talk about all the engines that turned out okay without using running in oil, and that's fine. But this thing's not going to have the luxury of driving around the streets for thousands of Ks to bed in. This will maybe run for an hour before it goes to the track, and when it comes out of pit lane, it'll be full throttle on the limiter, and we need to know that this thing's right. We need the rings to bed in right, we need the lifters to settle nice onto the cam, we need the bearings and everything to be protected on initial startup, so we use the right oil for the job, and we use the running in engine oil. We use our ProShift ATF in the power steering because it handles the heat a little bit better. But other than that, this thing's essentially factory. After we filled the engine with engine oil, we pull the fuel pump fuse out, crank the engine over to get oil pressure. We've put the fuel pump fuse back in, cycled the fuel pump a couple of times to bleed the injectors. So hopefully when this thing starts up, it starts up nice and clean. And another reason for bleeding the fuel up before we try to start the engine is in case we've got a fuel leak, we can find it before we're trying to start the engine. Another thing you should do is clean the floor under the car. A lot of guys don't do it, but it's simple. If you've got a leak, you want to find it. You don't want to be standing here arguing with your mates that it had a leak, but the oil was on the ground beforehand, or you're not quite sure, or whatever. Clean the floor, that way you know if you've got a leak or not, and you can fix it straight away. It's a lot easier to fix it here in the workshop than at the racetrack. So just clean the floor. Simple. Another thing you should have handy is a fire extinguisher, because things don't always go to plan. If you've got an extinguisher, know where it is and know how to use it. Hopefully we won't need it. But we've double checked everything. We're pretty sure we're on top of it. We're hoping this thing's going to start up clean. It's got new lifters, so they should be noisy. But other than that, it should be pretty straightforward. Now another thing I do, and it's probably a bad habit at this point, is I spray the exhaust manifold with WD, like a WD-40 or an inox or a water dispersant. That way if this thing does start up with a misfire, I can look in there and tell straight away where that misfire is. It'll be the exhaust manifold that hasn't burnt the water dispersant off it. So it speeds up diagnostics. You can make a call if you're going to leave it running or switch it off. Obviously being first startup, we want to leave it running until it gets to operating temperature, switch it off and drop the oil. We need to drop the oil out of it because the oil's full of assembly lube from putting the engine together. We need all that gone, we need new oil filter. So another reason why we use the running in engine oil. It's designed for that. A lot of guys will just use the cheapest oil they can find and wonder why they have weird wear in their engine. And it's from that initial first startup. So this engine oil will only be in here for half an hour and then it's gone. It's done its job, and then we can put a decent oil in it and we know that we're on top of it. But less talking, let's see if this thing starts. Well, the good news is we didn't have a misfire on initial startup, but what we didn't have is oil pressure. The oil pressure hardly came up at all, and the lifters were really, really noisy, so I've shut it down. I've just cracked the oil filter and there's no oil in the oil filter, so it hasn't pumped any oil whatsoever. So I better start pulling some stuff apart. We'll see what we can find. If we can find the reason for this, and hopefully we haven't damaged anything in the engine. About the only thing I can check with the engine still in the car is the pressure relief valve. So it's just a matter of removing the filter housing, which isn't too bad, power steering pump off and move the bracket and you can get to it. And the pressure relief valve wasn't stuck, it was actually in there backwards. And I've heard of this happening before, and some idiot has put it in backwards. So I've kind of made the decision that I'm going to put it back together and start it up just to see what happens. At this point, you either pull it out and pull it apart and make sure nothing's hurt, or you just start it up and see what it's like. And I'll check the oil pressure. If the oil pressure is not spot on, it has to come out. But I'm hoping there's enough assembly lube in there for the amount of time that it actually ran that I haven't done any damage. We won't know that till we fire it up. So I'm going to get it back together. We'll hit that key again and we'll see what happens. Yeah, all very good. I did some work. I got my hands dirty, but at the end of the day, there's no excuses. I put it together and I put it together wrong. And regardless from this point on, this engine's been damaged to some degree. We've reduced its life. Even if it's okay, we've still reduced its life. So the only way we're going to know is to hit the key and see what happens. I shouldn't have assumed because it's a cheap stocker that everything will be all right. So this time I've actually got the oil pressure gauge on it, so I know exactly what it's reading, and we'll only know when we hit the key. And let's be real. This is real world. If we didn't want you to see it, we would have deleted the video and pretended everything was okay, but this is exactly what's happened, and it does. It happens from time to time. It's unfortunate, and it's always the smallest lapse of concentration will lead to the biggest disasters. But all we can do now is hit the key, and we'll see what it's got. I've just shut this thing down. We've probably run it for 20-25 minutes until it came up to full operating temperature, until the fan cycled a couple of times. It sounded really good. The lifters, they went quiet pretty quick. It built oil pressure pretty quick. About 70 pound maximum oil pressure and probably 55 pound at its lowest. So that's about what I had expected. So hopefully we dodged the bullet. But I found the cleanest container I can find. I'm going to drop the running in engine oil into this, and I'll probably take a sample of it and send it away just to make sure we know what we got, just to make sure this thing's not killing itself. It sounds good, there's no knocks or rattles, but it doesn't mean that something's not going on inside. So I'll jump under the car, get this oil drained, and then we can put the proper oil in it, and then basically we're finished under the bonnet. Well, that's the initial startup done and out of the way. I've let the oil sit in the clean container for a little while. I've taken my oil sample, and about all I can find in the bottom of the oil at this point is a spider and its nest. I don't know how they got in there, but they've obviously migrated into the engine between the time we've built it and put it back into the car. I'll let this cool down for a little bit more. When it's cooled down, I will use our KCK 20W50 racing engine oil. Pushrod engines love it. It's got that extra bit of zinc that the other guys don't have that really gives you the protection you need. It handles the heat and also handles race fuel and extra fuel contamination that you might get, especially in a race car from start-stop stuff before it, you get to the track and it gets up to operating temperature. But that's it for this episode. Initial startup with no oil pressure is done. We'll never talk about this again. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed, and I'll see you on the next video.